Against the motion, Jeffrey Rosen, to the podium, please. Don't worry, I've got a clock here.
I want my That ominous one is an Orwellian and appropriate note for the evening. Congressman Barr has argued eloquently that more domestic surveillance of American citizens would not have prevented 9/11. I'd like to offer two additional reasons to try to persuade you to argue against the motion, better, more domestic surveillance than another 9/11. The first has to do with effectiveness. It's possible to protect privacy and security at the same time. Possible, in other words, to reduce the risk of terrorism without dramatically increasing the surveillance of American citizens. And the second has to do with abuse. Mr. McCarthy talked about the comparative trifles, the minor incursions on privacy that were necessary since 9/11 to protect us. But in fact, history shows that every time the government has asked for and been granted broader powers of surveillance, it has not directed those expanded powers against suspected terrorists, but instead has used them to conduct dragnets, ineffective dragnets, that have menaced the privacy of innocent citizens without making us safer. What do I mean when I say that it's possible to protect privacy and security at the same time? I have in mind the evolution of a surveillance technology that some of you may have read about, and we can call this the naked machine, because this is more or less what it is. This is the high-tech, three-dimensional millimeter imaging machine that was initially used at a Florida airport a couple of years ago to detect contraband. It can identify not only metal, but anything that's buried under clothing, ceramics or plastics. It's a very effective X-ray machine. The only downside is that it shows us completely stark naked. Now, the people who designed this machine came up with a simple programming shift. They found that it's able to maintain the pictures of the ceramics or the plastics and the contraband, but to take the pictures of the naked body and scramble it, scramble the anatomically sensitive regions into a nondescript blob. Now, obviously, this wonderful alternative, the blob machine, as opposed to the naked machine, is for many of us an act of mercy, especially for those of you this evening who are intellidating. You can invite each other afterward, come by and check out the blob machine, much safer than the naked machine. And it's also a silver bullet technology. It provides just as much security without any threat to privacy. It shows, in fact, that it's possible to protect our security without any, as it were, domestic surveillance. Now, I'm convinced that all of the laws and technologies that have been proposed since 9/11 can be designed in ways that look more like the blob machine than the naked machine. And it's sheerly willfulness that has led the other side to resist these well-designed laws and technologies for badly designed ones that menace privacy without making us safer. Let me try to persuade you by giving an example of the evolution of one of the most controversial and important surveillance programs since 9/11. This is the program that was originally known as Total Information Awareness. In its original incarnation, the government proposed to unite a lot of information that's held by public and private databases, magazine subscriptions, consumer records, internet browsing, to unite that with public arrest records, and then to conduct vast data mining that would try to predict whose travel patterns resembled those of the 9/11 terrorists, and to stop those people at airports. Now, what was wrong with this system? It wouldn't have worked, and it posed grave threats to privacy. But aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, it was an excellent system. Why would it have been ineffective? Well, if you imagine that the next attack looks nothing like the last one, it takes place, God forbid, on a train rather than a plane, then modeling the travel patterns of the 9/11 people will lead to the arrest of a lot of retired businessmen in Florida who take flying lessons, but will miss all the real terrorists. And given the huge numbers of false positives, the nation's airports would be brought to a halt. The second problem is privacy. The comparative trifles that Mr. McCarthy so sneeringly dismissed would have allowed the government to store in a centralized database all sorts of records that it could then use to menace its enemies, just as the Nixon administration did when it went after the tax returns of Vietnam protesters and threatened them with prosecution. Now, the evolution of total information awareness is a positive story, and one that very much supports our side because of the opposition of a bipartisan coalition of libertarian conservatives like Congressman Barr and civil libertarian liberals like Professor Rosen. the system was refined. First, the government was prohibited from sharing information with law enforcement agents unless there was evidence of a serious crime or a violent terrorist act, avoiding that kind of discriminatory menacing of political enemies. And second, the government abandoned the foolish idea of trying to predict future attacks based on the patterns of past ones, and instead merely confirmed that people are who they say they are at the airports, a more modest goal, but one that makes us safer. What initially began as a naked machine technology evolved into a blob machine one, and across the range of laws and technologies, we can tell a similar story. So the trade-off that the other side falsely presents you with need not exist. Now, what about the abuse? It's clear that every time the government has been granted new authorities, it's abused them not to focus on suspected terrorists, but instead to menace innocent citizens. And this is not a surprise, because the essence of the Patriot Act, which was not a minor change in American surveillance laws, but a significant one in several respects, the government used to only be able to engage in warrantless searches in secret without notifying the people whose data was being searched if they could prove in advance that the target was a suspected spy or foreign terrorist. But because of the changes in the Patriot Act, the government is now able to engage in secret warrantless surveillance of anyone's data merely by asserting that the data is relevant to a terrorist investigation. Should we be surprised when the FBI, using this new authority, issued not a couple of carefully chosen national security letters, but according to the Inspector General's recent report, 140,000 national security letters in the past 3 years? And according to his reports, most of those letters were not for suspected terrorists, but for people who had nothing to do with terrorism? And should we be surprised that that data was not a trifling threat to privacy, but was stored in centralized database and kept for 20 years? Should we be surprised that people who visited Las Vegas during a false terrorist threat had their hotel records and gambling records stored in that centralized database without their knowledge because of this foolish and misguided program? Or that the FBI, which couldn't even get David Frum's address right, was so inept that it didn't keep records of the national security letters that it issued and therefore didn't know when it was getting the right or wrong data? How could you possibly trust the government with expanded authority when it used the authority that was given so recklessly? The government's approach to this problem is much like that scene out of Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy, where Woody Allen suddenly comes up to Mia Farrow's window on a flying bicycle and says, "Hop on." And she's sort of skeptical, and he says, "Trust me, it's me, Andrew, hop on." She's still skeptical, he says, "Trust me anyway." This is the government's approach to this problem, trust me anyway, and we've seen too much of their abuse of this power since 9/11 to continue to engage in this trust. So we are saying not that it's not important to take the terrorist threat seriously, but we need meaningful oversight focused on genuine terrorists, while protecting the privacy of innocent citizens. We can do that through law. We can do that through technology. We have in our hands the ability to protect privacy and security at the same time. What we need now is the will. Thank you very much.